Silly season is well and truly here, and with 10 seats taken and 10 remaining, now is the perfect time to discuss who may end up where. Stick around as we predict the 2025 grid.
So I think the top of the grid, I don't think we're going to see too much movement. A lot of the drivers have already been secured and they know where they're going and staying. The bottom of the grid, I think, is where we'll get to, and there'll be a lot of movement down that end. But let's start at Red Bull Racing. We've got Max Verstappen secure, and Sergio Perez re-signed his contract last week. He's going to be staying until at least the end of 2025, I believe, on a 1+1. What did you make of that decision? Do you think that there's anyone better who could have been in that seat, or is he the right choice for them?
Yeah, exactly as you said, Christian Horner has confirmed that Checo signed a 1+1 deal, meaning that there's potentially performance clauses and he could be out of that seat at the end of 2025 instead of seeing it all the way through to 2026. I do think it was interesting that they picked Checo again for that seat, given his slight downturn in performances recently, but I think Red Bull are hoping that he's going to pick his performances back up again and be able to continue to deliver for the team.
Yeah, I do think whether this lineup will stay like this into 26 will depend on how Checo performs, and basically whether he can get out of this slump that he finds himself in, and potentially also how he gets himself out of it. At the moment, we know he's costing Red Bull quite a lot of money in crash damages, and obviously Helmut Marko's not that reliable of a source, as we know, but he said that it could affect their development into the year, which does follow the logic. The more money you spend repairing a car now, the less money you have to spend on developments and upgrades later in the year, which at this point in the season, with it being as competitive as it is, could be costing Red Bull a championship. We don't know that, but by the end of the season, I think that probably could be the case.
Yeah, and I think we have to look at who would replace Sergio Perez if he was to be taken out of that contract early. And for me, that would be either of the V-CARB drivers. Obviously, the V-CARB team is trying to be less of the Red Bull junior team now, but as they're all contracted by Red Bull, I think it's only natural for one of them to move up into that main team seat. And then I think that would give the opportunity for Liam Lawson to move up into the seat as he was promised for 2025.
Yeah, that would solve the sort of problem that Liam is presenting for them at the moment. V-CARB sort of have 3 drivers for 2 seats. And if one of the V-CARBs was to upgrade to the Red Bull seat, then that would obviously free up a seat for Liam, as you said. But I think that a lot of people are wondering whether Daniel is good enough to take that seat again. You could argue he's not performing well enough right now to be taking that seat, but we know he did that Silverstone test where he was putting in lap times that were a couple of tenths off Max and better than those that Sergio was doing at that time. And he's also reliable and clean as a driver. This last weekend in Canada, he didn't make any mistakes in those tricky conditions. And that's something that they'll be looking for out of a driver. So arguably, yes, he's not performing at the moment to the level he should be, but is Sergio either? And I think that's maybe an argument for them to consider Daniel, even though he's had a bit of a downturn of performance as well. But Yuki, he's on the opposite end, had an upturn of performance that'll mean he's in contention for the seat as well. But do you think Red Bull would put Yuki in that seat, or do you think they've written him off in terms of his maturity? Because I kind of feel like it leans that way slightly.
Yeah, I almost feel like Red Bull never really have plans to move Yuki up. There never seems to be talk about moving Yuki into that bigger team, no matter how good he gets. So to be honest, I know this is for the 2025 grid, but I can see Yuki leaving at the end of 2025 once he's seen out his contract with V-CARB.
Yeah, I agree. I think we'll get on to where I think Yuki will end up for 2025 and beyond. But yeah, I think Red Bull have learned from their Gasly Albon phase of putting a driver in that second seat before they were ready. And I feel like that a couple of years ago, they probably would have put Yuki in as he is now. But I think having had those experiences with those 2 drivers, they've hopefully learned from that mistake, and will give their drivers a bit more time until they're ready to go alongside Max.
Okay, so obviously on our virtual grid, Red Bull is already filled out with Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez for 2025. Okay, so moving on to Ferrari, obviously we've got Charles Leclerc staying there. He signed a contract extension in January 2024, and that was for several more seasons to come. So obviously he's there for the foreseeable future. And then we had Lewis Hamilton, obviously with his shock move at the start of the year. He announced his move to Ferrari in February, and it's understood that his contract is for 1 year with the option of extending for another year. And obviously Ferrari are going to be putting a large investment into his Mission 44 organisation as a part of that. How do you think Ferrari's lineup for 2025 looks? Do you think it's one of the strongest on the grid?
I think it could be. I'm very interested to see, this is one of the things I'm most excited about for next season, is to see this dynamic between Charles and Lewis, but also between Lewis and Ferrari. Obviously, he's been at Mercedes for so long now that it's kind of unimaginable for him to be at any other team. So I'm very interested to see him at another team after so long at one, and sort of see how he adapts to that and how he'll deal with the car. The car at the moment is more competitive than the Mercedes, as we know. And I feel like at the moment, Lewis is sort of kind of signed out of Mercedes a little bit. He's not motivated anymore to be making this car better because it doesn't affect him at the end of the day. Now he's moving away for the following season. So yes, he's trying to be motivational and positive for the team, but at the same time, whether they get those upgrades in and they work or not doesn't matter for him at this point. And I feel like he's not over it, but a little bit over it at Mercedes. So I'm very interested to see how he'll cope with this new challenge and whether that'll give him like a new lease of competition and a new... I think his motivation to win is still there. So I'm interested to see whether this kind of releases that and lets him win and lets him get those podiums again, and what that does for Lewis and his confidence and him as a person as well.
Definitely. I think we're going to see an interesting dynamic within Ferrari as well if they have a car that's able to fight for a championship. I mean, who do you think that they would back as their drivers' championship champion? Obviously, Charles has been there for the long term, but then they've paid so much to bring Lewis in, and he's a 7-time world champion. It's obvious he wants this 8th. Do they let him have it, or what do you think happens there?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to see this dynamic. I think the grid is only going to get tighter next year. We're going to have a lot of competition at the top end with Red Bull, McLaren, potentially Mercedes, but also Ferrari will be definitely in there and fighting potentially for a championship, as we might see towards the end of this year as well. I don't know who they will back, and I think that's part of the excitement. Is it's going to be kind of, I think, taken on a race by race basis, particularly at the start of the season. And kind of whoever's doing the best at that time will be the driver they prioritise and back going forward. And I don't think we'll get an answer to that question until sort of mid-season if there's an actual championship battle on their hands.
So with Charles Leclerc re-signing his contract in January and Lewis Hamilton's shock move to Ferrari in February, we have Ferrari's driver lineup for 2025 completed and added to our virtual grid.
On to Mercedes, and we enter our first bit of unknown of this journey through the virtual grid. We've got a spare seat next to George Russell for 2025 and potentially beyond. Who have you gone for to fill that?
I've gone for Andrea Kimi Antonelli. Obviously, Toto Wolff has been very open about his interest in this talent. I think Mercedes need hope from somewhere, and their eyes are on Kimi Antonelli.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've put Kimi Antonelli as well. I think I can really see them taking the gamble on him. It's not too risky, I don't think, to put him in the car for 25. They're not going to be fighting for a championship, I don't think, next year. They're not quite at that point with the car. So I think 2025 is the perfect year kind of to give Kimi a bit of testing, give him a run in that car without there being too much on the line. Obviously, it's F1, so there's always something on the line. But that then sets him up, hopefully, for a good charge in 2026 when Mercedes could be back at the top potentially. We don't know where they're going to be in terms of the car, but the power units have got a big emphasis in 2026. And with how they went in 2014 when the turbo hybrid era began, we could be on for something from Mercedes. So I think they'll want a year to set up Kimi. I don't agree with the notion of putting him in the Williams for a year. I kind of think that's wasted time. Get him in the Mercedes, get him on track, and get him ready and raring to go for 26.
Yeah, I completely agree. Obviously, he's been a huge talent so far. He's been part of that Mercedes program since he was 11 years old, and has won Italian F4, ADAC Formula 4, Formula Regional Championships, just to name a few. And he skipped F3 now to join F2 for this year, where he currently sits 6th. So obviously, he's got a bright future ahead of him. And yeah, I completely agree. I think just get him in that Mercedes seat, get him used to that team. So then hopefully for 2026 and beyond, they can begin to use him to fight for championships, even if that's not drivers, constructor championships where he can bring vital points to the team.
Definitely, it is risky, but imagine if it pays off, they'll look like absolute heroes.
Exactly. So with George Russell under contract until the end of 2025 and a bright young talent in Kimi Antonelli making his way through the ranks, F1 could be his next drive, and so he joins Mercedes on our virtual grid. Okay, so moving on to McLaren, and again we have a team that's fully contracted. We've got Lando Norris, who re-signed with McLaren in January. A lot of drivers made their extensions in January, and he's extended beyond the 2025 season. And then again, we've got Oscar Piastri, who extended his contract in his rookie year in September 2023, and he'll stay at the Woking-based team until the end of 2026. What do you think of their lineup? Obviously, it's proved to be very successful so far, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly strong lineup. I think it could be one of the strongest on the grid going into 2025 and 2026 as well. Obviously, there's not a lot going on there. They're sticking with both of them for 2026, at least until the end of 2026, sorry. And with the way that their development and their car is going, I can see this being their lineup beyond that, though, to be honest. I think we could be looking at Lando and Oscar there until 28, 30 potentially, with no real reason to change them. They get on well. There's not much competition between them at the moment. There is friendly competition, of course, but when a championship's on the line, that could obviously sour things. You never know. But I don't really see that happening. I think they're a solid team, solid driver lineup, and I'm excited to see where McLaren can go next year.
Exactly. I think even in a tense situation, Oscar seems like such a chilled out driver that I don't think anything would bother him.
Yeah.
And obviously, this is only his second year in Formula One, and we're already speaking about him like he's been there for years. So, a really, really phenomenal talent they have in Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. So, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And yeah, I can understand why McLaren have continued their lineup into 2026. So, with both current McLaren drivers already contracted beyond 2025, they join our virtual grid too.
Okay, on to Aston Martin. There was a little bit of uncertainty here, but Lance Stroll last week has confirmed that he will be staying for 2025 at least. I think he's on a rolling contract, obviously, because of his dad owning the team. So I think he just sort of goes into a year and see how he feels and whether he wants to stay around and see how their development is going as well. And he said that he thinks that's really strong, so he'd like to hang around. Fernando Alonso also confirmed his new contract in April. He'll be staying there at least until the end of 2026, I believe. That was an interesting contract, I thought, with interesting terms to it as well. He said it was probably his last, but that he's also got a lifetime deal with Aston Martin. What do you think that could mean for him?
Yeah, I wonder if it's something to do with the road car side of Aston Martin, to be honest. Obviously, they've got that side of the business and then the racing side of the business. And I feel like that's the only explanation for sort of a lifetime contract. Maybe there's going to be a Fernando Alonso edition, Aston Martins or something, which would be cool. But the thing that interests me about that contract is obviously going into 2026, Aston Martin are going to be using Honda engines. And obviously with Fernando Alonso being banned from using Honda engines after their stint with McLaren, I think that's going to be an interesting partnership.
Yeah, for sure. I think we spoke earlier about Yuki Tsunoda, and that's where I had him potentially moving to for 26. I know we're talking about 25, but I think 26 sort of comes with it at the moment. I can kind of see Yuki getting fed up with the fact that he's not going to get that second Red Bull seat and moving potentially to an Aston Martin. I think that could be a good project for him. They'll like the fact he knows a lot about Red Bull, and I think he could be a good driver to take that car up to another level. It could be that he takes Stroll's seat if Stroll decides that he doesn't want to be a part of Aston, potentially after he finds out how they're going to perform on the regs in 26. This could be a 27 move even.
Absolutely, and that would be a phenomenal lineup, Alonso and Tsunoda. I did have Tsunoda down as taking the Aston Martin reserve had he not have taken up that V-CARB contract, just so he was in that team ready for 2026. But obviously with Fernando re-signing his contract and Lance saying that he's going to continue with the team, there's no space for Yuki there at the moment. So with Lance Stroll's rolling contract and Fernando Alonso's lifetime contract, both Aston Martin drivers also join our virtual grid. So both Alpine drivers have a contract until the end of 2024. We know Esteban Ocon's planning to move on to a different team. We're not sure where exactly yet. But that opens up 2 spaces on the grid at Alpine. Who do you think will fill those spots?
I think Alpine will be trying their hardest to retain Gasly, so I've put him in one seat and I've got Jack Doohan, their current reserve driver, in the other seat. I feel like they're going to be looking to keep Gasly around just to keep a bit of consistency. We know Alpine at the moment is going through a lot of turmoil, a lot of employee turnover, for the higher-ups and the engineers and the technical side, but now also the drivers as Ocon is leaving. I don't think it's a very attractive team to be driving for at the moment, unfortunately. I think from the outside looking in, I, for one, if I was a driver, wouldn't be wanting to go there, I don't think. There doesn't seem to be much promise in their technical side. The car isn't great, and obviously there's a lot of sort of rivalry almost within the team itself and a bit of sort of unrest. And I feel like that is why I've put Jack Doohan, because he's a reserve driver there at the moment. This could be his only shot for next year getting onto the grid, and obviously it's opened up within the last couple of weeks. So I think he'll be going there because he's a talented driver, but also because he knows the situation there and he potentially knows where they're going more than anyone from the outside would at the moment. They're not really advertising themselves too well, I don't think.
Exactly. I've also got Pierre Gasly and Jack Doohan. Obviously, as you said, Gasly has the contract until the end of 2024. But with the instability that Esteban Ocon leaving brings the team, I think Gasly's likely to stick around. Again, I've also got Jack Doohan. He is currently their reserve driver. He's been carrying out private Formula One tests with them with their 2021 and 2022 machinery. He's also got a few FP1 sessions lined up with them this year. Obviously, he had that one in Canada, which only really turned out to be, I think, 2 laps because of all the rain. But yeah, like you say, he already knows the situation of the team. I've heard that everybody within the team is fond of him. Bruno Famin's fond of him. He thinks he's a talented driver. So I think he's probably the right choice for that seat. So yeah, it's Pierre Gasly and Jack Doohan for me as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if for Jack Doohan we see a similar situation to Behrman's free practice sessions down at Haas. He's getting 6 throughout the year. I think he's already used one of those. But I wouldn't be surprised now that Ocon is leaving. I don't think the team are going to do him any favours. And I think they'll probably start to give his car over to Jack for some more than just the 2 mandated rookie sessions. I think they'll probably run him a few more times and get him in that car so they can see what he can do. I think they already know, to be honest, though. And I think at this point they'd be a little bit silly not to put him in the car and give him at least a chance. We know you can always take a driver out as well if it doesn't work out, but he's looking promising. He's obviously done well in the lower formulas as well. So excited for Jack to get that opportunity. And I think if they can retain Gasly, that could be a solid lineup. I'll be interested to see as well how Gasly does without the competition of Ocon as well. We know there's that history between them. So there's almost been a bit of fighting of the egos kind of down at Alpine. And without that, will that free up Gasly to do better performances? Will that mean that the team themselves perform better because they're not having to manage any situations? I'm not entirely sure what the picture was down at Alpine between them, but I feel like it could ease things a little bit and hopefully help them move up another level in the championship potentially.
So with both Alpine drivers' contracts running out at the end of this year and Esteban Ocon deciding to leave the team, we're taking Pierre Gasly and their current reserve driver Jack Doohan into 2025 and adding them to our virtual grid.
Okay, on to V-CARB. Yuki Tsunoda obviously signed his new contract to stay at the team for 2025. He signed that last week in Canada. And for the second seat, I'm going to stick with Daniel Ricciardo. I think he has done enough, technically speaking, for the team. He obviously brings in sponsorships. We know he had a big part in bringing on both Visa and Cash App, who are now title sponsors of the team. Laura Mekies loves him. Peter Bayer loves him. I don't think they're going to be getting rid of him anytime soon.
Yeah, I agree. I've also got Daniel Ricciardo in my V-CARB for 2025. I think although his performances haven't been there at the start of the season, they are starting to come back. Obviously, we had the P4 in the Miami Sprint, P5 in the Canadian GP qualifying. And I think obviously he's helping that car out so much technically and setting the team up to be a very marketable team. Obviously, if Red Bull one day decide to sell V-CARB, having it as its own team with all of these sponsors is going to be very helpful in deciding on a sale price for it and getting them more money for the team. So yeah, I think he's going to stick around for 2025.
Yeah, the driving, as you said, hasn't been ideal, but when it is good, it is good. When he's got that car beneath him, he can do those performances, which unfortunately at the moment are few and far between. But with upgrades coming through the year, I think that might change. And I also think people have a tendency to overlook the importance of marketability and the business side of these teams, and the importance of a driver to that. We saw, an example of that is Red Bull retaining Checo because of his merch sales potentially. He sells a lot more merch in South America and that market than Max Verstappen or any other driver would, and that's a huge market for Red Bull on the energy drink side of things as well. So Red Bull, especially as a team and as a family of teams, is more aware of that than others on the grid, I would suppose. And I think Daniel Ricciardo is a huge asset to them in that sense. But we can't get away as well from the fact he's obviously been a huge technical asset for them as well. That car, before he got in it, was at the back of the grid. And now it's at the top of the midfield, lower end of the midfield every week. A P12 to 14 is a bad weekend for them at the moment, which I think says something to how well that car's developed. And obviously there's more upgrades coming through the year, as I said. So I don't think they'll be changing him anytime soon.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people online like to jump onto Daniel for his performances, but the team have openly said that they're working on making that car better for him. They understand the problems and they've almost taken the blame as being the team rather than the driver. They obviously see the potential that he has. They see a lot more than the public do of him on the simulator, of him, technically developing the car. And so I think he's definitely still a huge asset for that team. And I can see them carrying him through to 2025 for that reason. So with Yuki Tsunoda re-signing his V-CARB contract in Canada and Daniel Ricciardo still being a huge technical asset for the team, I think we're going to see both drivers continue through to 2025. And so we've added both Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki Tsunoda to our virtual grid. Okay, so moving on to the next team now, who could be one of the big players in the driver market for 2025, and that is Williams. So they've already got Alex Albon, who they've re-signed on a multi-year deal until at least the end of 2026. James Vowles describes him as a championship level driver, and so I think they're looking for somebody who can match his caliber in that team. And I have gone for Carlos Sainz as the driver who will join Alex Albon in 2025. Who have you gone for?
I've gone for Carlos too. I think potentially controversial that a driver like Carlos could end up at a lower back marker team, but I think it's out of the two options he's left with, I think it's the one that makes the most sense. And it's, to be honest, the one that I would go with if I was presented with those choices. I think he's having to choose between the Audi project and the James Vowles project at Williams, potentially. And I kind of feel like Carlos on this driver market was an interesting thing. I think he went into this year, obviously he was the only driver last year who won a race who wasn't driving for Red Bull. So this year he obviously also won Australia. I think having those 2 wins and being one of the only drivers in this Red Bull era of domination to have won a race has sort of meant that he went into this driver market perhaps inflating his value and overinflating his value, and rightly so. That's a strong title to have to your name as one of the only drivers who could defeat Red Bull in that period of dominance, particularly last year. But I think in doing so, he's waited too long and he's lost options higher up the grid. Like Red Bull had that free seat. Mercedes have still got a free seat, but there's not really been too much discussion about him moving to Mercedes. So I think that's off the table. And he's ultimately ended up with these short-term pain, long-term gain projects of Williams and Audi. And I think asked between the two of them, I would go for James Vowles because of the power unit side. You've got Mercedes as a power unit for 2026. And also James Vowles' technical background and knowledge, I think, is second to none. And he's running that team incredibly well at the moment. So that would be my reasoning for the choice. But what's yours?
So yeah, obviously Carlos does have that choice between Audi/Sauber and Williams. Obviously Audi look like they could be extremely strong. They have the resources to be strong, but that's going to take a few years to come into action. Obviously Carlos's dad has links with Audi as well, so there's that kind of family ties with Audi. But then we've got James Vowles publicly courting Carlos Sainz in interviews. He's revealed that Carlos Sainz is Williams' main target for that 2025 seat. And yeah, like you said, they've got James Vowles' ambitions. They've got a contract with Mercedes HPP for 2026. And so I think Williams just looks like the clever choice for Sainz, rather than taking a huge risk on Audi that could take a few years to pay off. I think going to a team that has been championship level before is probably the right decision for him.
Yeah, I think we've briefly mentioned the influence of the power unit on his decision potentially, but I think Audi are coming into this having never made a Formula One power unit before, and there's a massive unknown there. And with the emphasis the power unit will have in the 2026 regulations and the hybridization as well, there's a lot that you can get right, but there's also a lot that you can get wrong. And I think Audi is a complete unknown in that sense. Yes, they probably, if they've met with him, will have presented him with plans and how they're getting on with that side of things. But publicly, there's no information about how that's going. And Williams, obviously using Mercedes power units, we know how that went for them. As I said earlier, the last time there was a big regulation shift that emphasised the power unit. So yes, it's not the Mercedes works team, obviously, but having that in your car is never a bad thing. Mercedes has also been an incredibly reliable power unit in the recent years. So I think that would be heavily weighing on my mind if I was Carlos trying to pick a team at the moment. And if I was not Carlos, I'd be advising him of that, to kind of consider these things in making your decision, because to get the value out of these deals, these longer term deals, he has to be there for a while, and you don't want to be there with DNFs week in, week out because of engine issues. So I think being on track is obviously the best way to develop a car, and I think Williams will give him that best opportunity to then fight further up the grid in the coming years.
So with James Vowles guiding Williams back to their former glory, they've already got Alex Albon signed on a multi-year contract, and we both think that Carlos Sainz will join the Williams project for 2025.
So moving further down the grid, and we're on to Haas. There are 2 seats free at Haas. Kevin Magnussen's contract runs out at the end of this year, and Nico Hülkenberg is moving to Sauber as it becomes Audi into 2026. Who have you got in those 2 seats and why?
So I think my most obvious choice for the seats is Ollie Behrman. Obviously, he had made a fantastic first impression when he took over the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, he's already got 6 FP1 sessions lined up with Haas. I think that's a huge statement of intent from them, and I don't see it going to anybody else other than Ollie Behrman. And then in my other seat, I've gone for a bit of a twist, and that is Esteban Ocon. And now, I wouldn't have really put Ocon in this list, to be honest, had he not sounded so confident in an interview that he had another seat lined up for 2025. Truthfully, I don't see him fitting in anywhere else in the grid, and so Haas was kind of the only place where I could see him going. So yeah, I've got Ollie Behrman and Esteban Ocon. Who have you got?
I've got Kevin Magnussen and Ollie Behrman purely because I think Haas I think their risk-taking days are over when it comes to rookie drivers. Obviously, the Mick Schumacher, Nikita Mazepin era wasn't too great for them, having two brand new drivers in the car. Not that Ocon is a brand new driver, but I think they'll want a bit of consistency and a bit of guidance for Ollie as well into his first proper year in Formula One. Obviously, he did those kind of audition weekend in Saudi Arabia for Ferrari. Whether it's right for them to keep Kevin or not, I'm not too sure. I don't know if he is the strongest available option at the moment. Obviously, there's a lot of drivers who will be out of a seat by the time we finish this virtual grid. And I would argue perhaps maybe a Bottas or Zhou could be a better option. Zhou obviously bringing the value of his Chinese sponsors, but also he's been a good driver, I think, so far at Sauber. So he could be an option, a young option as well, to partner Ollie Behrman with a few years under his belt in Formula One. But we also know that Valtteri Bottas is an incredibly experienced driver at a similar level to Kevin, and potentially a cleaner and safer option in that sense. We also know that Kevin is an incredibly good team player. So there's reasons for both, I think, and for going each way. So yeah, does Kevin have what it takes to lead a rookie? You'll have to look back at his Magnussen Schumacher years in 2022. Yes, Mick wasn't a rookie, but he was a young driver. So I don't know if what I would do if I was at Haas. I think I would probably retain Kevin Magnussen for the safety, but with the knowledge that there are these other drivers who will be free for the year after if needed.
So we've come to the point on our virtual grid where we both have a difference of opinion. So we're going to split the grid into two parts. We've got Dan's virtual grid and we've got Lucy's virtual grid. Going on Lucy's virtual grid are Ollie Behrman and Kevin Magnussen for Haas, and going on mine are Ollie Behrman and Esteban Ocon. So as we previously mentioned, Nico Hülkenberg will be moving to Sauber for 2025 as it begins its transition into the Audi Works team for 2026. Obviously that leaves one spare seat for 2025. Who have you gone for in that seat?
I've gone for two drivers because I'm not sure who. They're not going to split the seat. I just don't know which one it's going to be. So I've gone for potentially Zhou Guanyu or Esteban Ocon. For me, it's the kind of Haas reject almost. Like you had Esteban Ocon in the Haas, and I've only put him as an option for stake for the reason that you put him as an option for Haas, because he sounded so confident the other day that he knew where he was going and that news about his future would be announced in due course. And I don't think you'd be saying things like that in the media pen if you didn't know what you were talking about. So that's the reason why I've put him. I'm not entirely sure he'd be a good fit in that team. It's hard for me to envisage Esteban Ocon being anywhere other than Renault and Alpine until it happens, I don't think, because he's been there for so long and he's kind of synonymous with that team and that brand at this point for me. So he could go there, but I think Zhou Guanyu could also be an equally good, if not better, option for Audi, especially as they do become Audi, because of his ability to market things to the Chinese market. And I think Audi will find that particularly strong for their automotive car side of things as well. They'll want to potentially open up that side of things and use their Formula One driver to market their road cars. Why not, if you've got that option? We also know that Zhou has been incredibly even with Valtteri Bottas this year. So I think he's a good option on track, and I think the sooner he has his future locked down will be the better for Zhou. I think we've seen him make a couple of mistakes in the last couple of weekends, potentially because that's at the back of his mind. He's still fairly new to Formula One, and performing when you haven't got a contract is a high pressure situation. So I think if he can lock down a contract for Audi, that'll be incredible for him. But I'm not sure whether that'll be the case. I'm interested to hear who you've got in the seat, to be honest, because I'm very unsure.
Yeah, I've gone for Valtteri Bottas.
Okay.
So obviously he's already there at the moment. But he was who I thought would go to Williams until James Vowles was so public about going for Carlos Sainz. I think if Carlos ends up going to Audi, then it'll be Valtteri in the Williams. And if Carlos ends up going to Williams, it'll be Valtteri in the Audi or in the Sauber for 2025. He was at Mercedes while they were such a strong team. And I think as Sauber transform into Audi, that's exactly what they'll be looking for. And they'll be looking for sort of the tips and an insight into how Mercedes was run back in that day that only Valtteri Bottas will be able to give them. Aside from that, obviously, he's an extremely talented driver. And I think, he is a reliable choice that will bring results. And so, I think it's pretty straightforward.
I don't want to kind of take away from Valtteri's achievements in any way. I'm just going to play devil's advocate here for a minute. But do you not think Audi will be looking for a driver with the ability to develop them technically? Now, we've seen at stake the whole time Valtteri's been there, not a lot has happened with that car. It's been at the back of the grid back of the midfield the whole time. They've not really made any steps. If anything, they've gone backwards. Do you think that will affect Audi's choice if you think they're going to go for Valtteri Bottas?
I would argue that's less about Valtteri and more about the sort of investment into the team, not financially, but sort of obviously Alfa Romeo was coming to the end of their turn in Formula One when Valtteri joined. Now we've kind of got this weird midpoint with Stake/Kick, who are an online gambling and a live streaming website. You know, they don't really have the sort of technical ambitions that I would expect them to have. So yeah, I think now as they're transforming into Audi, and obviously Audi is a brand with a lot of race pedigree, I think Valtteri will finally be able to pull up on his experience and help them to technically develop that car.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say they're in a bit of a funny mid position. I think we spoke about this in a podcast last week about how Stake sort of have bigger issues than their driver lineup at the moment, frankly. They've got a high turnover of personnel. They've obviously got issues with their car. And all of that, I think, means they don't look great to outside hires as drivers in a similar way to Alpine, I suppose, before Audi come in. They don't look like a team that you'd particularly want to go to. They don't seem to have much ambition technically, as you said, until that Audi switch comes. And it feels like they've almost forgotten that these intermediate years also matter in terms of money in the Constructors' Championship, but also your appeal as a brand and as a team to sponsors. You know, Audi can't run that team alone. They need sponsors. And I think they're relying a lot right now on the Audi name to kind of do that for them, rather than the team as it is at the moment. I think that's a bit of a shame for these 2 years where we could be seeing some development. And, you know, this is the pinnacle of motorsport, and it feels like they're in a bit of a waiting room rather than taking advantage of what they've got under them at the moment. So, bit of a shame, but I hope it goes well for them when they turn into Audi, because otherwise I'm not entirely sure what they're going to do.
So for the final space on our virtual grid, Lucy has gone for Zhou Guanyu to fill that spot, and I've gone for Valtteri Bottas. Obviously the team's in a little bit of a strange point at the moment as they transform into Audi, and we're kind of unsure as to who would fit in that seat other than Carlos Sainz. So taking a look at our virtual grid, obviously Red Bull we've got Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez. Ferrari we've got Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. Mercedes, George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. McLaren, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. Aston Martin, Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll. Alpine, Pierre Gasly and Jack Doohan. V-CARB, Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki Tsunoda. Williams, Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz. For Haas, Lucy's gone for Ollie Behrman and Kevin Magnussen, and I've gone for Ollie Behrman and Esteban Ocon. And finally for Stake, Lucy's gone for Nico Hülkenberg and Zhou Guanyu, and I've gone for Nico Hülkenberg and Valtteri Bottas. So that's all for our 2025 driver predictions. Do you agree with our predictions, or would you have done it differently? Let us know in the comments, and make sure to subscribe to Apex for more deep dives into the F1 world.